Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Introduction to Psychology Part 1 PSY 312 by Dear Knowledge. In the methods of psychology, we have discussed and completed the descriptive method, and in this video we will be discussing the experimental method in the methods of psychology. In this video, we will discuss the variables and its types, which include the independent variables, the dependent variables, the experimental and the control group, random assignments, experimental hazards, placebo effect, and experimenter's effect. So let's start with the experimental method. The definition include a methods of demonstration cause and effect relationship by purposely manipulating a factor thought to produce change in a second factor, or you can say a deliberate manipulation of a variable to see if corresponding changes in behavior results, allowing the determination of cause and effect relationship. The only research method that will allow researchers to determine the cause of a behavior is the experiment. In an experiment, researchers deliberately manipulate the variable the thing is causing some behavior while holding all other variables that might interfere with the experimenter's results constant and unchanging. That way, they get changes in behavior. They know that those changes must be due to the manipulated variables. So the experimental method is a research method used to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between changes in one variable and the effects on another. Conducting an experiment involves deliberately varying one factor, which is called the independent variable. The researcher then measures what changes in this produces in a second factor, which is called the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is so named because changes in it depend on variation in the independent variable. Here you can see the cause and effect relationship in the experimental methods. In cause, there is a manipulation which leads to the measurement in the effect, and in cause, the independent variable in which the researchers measure what changes produces in a second factor, so that will be the dependent variable. So dependent variable is so named because changes in it depend on variation in the independent variable. Now let's start with the variables. First of all, we will just go for the definition. The variables is a variable something. A variable is something that can be changed or varied, such as a characteristics or a value. Variables are generally used in psychology, or you can say psychological experiments, to determine if changes to one thing result in changes to another. Variables play a crucial role in psychological research process. You can say that variables are another important step is to decide on the variables the researchers want to manipulate, which would be the one they think causes change in the behavior, and the variables they want to measure to see if there are any changes. This would be the effect of a behavior of the manipulation. Often deciding on the variables in the experiment comes before selection of the participants or the subjects. So in the example of aggression and the cartoons, the variables the researchers think cause changes in aggressive behavior. If you remember, I have uploaded a video on it and I have discussed about the aggression in children. In that video, we talked about how to study the effects of watching violent cartoons on children's aggressive behavior. So the most logical way to study that particular relationship is by experiment. If you haven't watched that video, I have given the link in description and you can watch it. So in the example of aggression and children's cartoons, the variables that researchers think causes changes in aggressive behavior is the violence in the cartoon. So researchers would want to manipulate that in some way, and in order to in order to do that, they have to define the violent cartoons. So they would have to find a cartoon that contains violence or make one. Then they would show that cartoons to the participant and try to measure their aggressive behavior afterwards. In measuring the aggressive behavior, they would have to specify exactly what they mean by aggressive behavior so that it can be measured. This is called an operational definition because it is specifically named the operations, which means the steps or procedures, so that the experimenter must use to control or measure the variables in the experiment. An operational definition of aggressive behavior might be a checklist of very specific actions such as hitting, pushing, and so on, that an observer can mark off as the children do the items on the list. If the observer were just told to look for aggressive behavior, so the researchers would probably get half a dozen or more different interpretations of what aggressive behavior is. Now let's start with the independent variable. The definition of independent variable is the purposely factor thought to produce change in experiment, or you can say variables in experiment that is manipulated by the experimental. Independent affects changes in the dependent variable. Independent variable. The name of the variable that is manipulated in any experiment is the independent variable. It is independent of anything that participants do. So the participants in the study do not get to choose or vary the dependent variable. Their behavior does not affect this variable. Now let's talk about the dependent variable. The definition include variable in an experiment that represents the measurable response or behavior of the subject in the experiment, or the factor that is observed and measured for change in an experiment thought to be influenced by the independent variable. Independent variable, the response of the participant to the manipulation of the dependent variable is a dependent variable, and the response of the participant that is measured is known as dependent variable. Their behavior, if hypothesis is correct, should depend on whether or not they were exposed to the independent variable. So the dependent variable is always the thing. The thing means a response of the subject or result of some actions that is measured to see how the independent variable may have affected it. So, to the greatest degree possible, all other conditions in the experiment are held constant. Thus, when the data are analyzed, any changes that occur in the dependent variable can be attributed to the deliberate variations of the independent variable. In this way, an experiment can demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Now, let's start the experimental and the control group. Researchers may find that children who watch the cartoons are aggressive, but how would they know if their aggressive behavior was caused by the cartoons or was just by natural aggressive level of those particular cartoon or by those particular children, or the result of the particular time of the day they were observed? Those sort of confounding variables are the variables that interfere with each other and their possible effect on some other variables of interest. So those sort of confounding variables are the kind of researchers have to control for in some way. For example, if the participant in an experiment were supposed to take only potassium supplement but took an iron supplement, any effects the potassium might have had on what the experiment was measuring would be confused. So with the effects that the iron supplement might have also had, the best way to control for confounding variables is to have two groups of participants: those who watch the violent cartoons and those who watch a non-violent cartoons for the same length of time. Then the researchers would measure the aggressive behavior in both groups. So if the aggressive behavior is significantly greater in the group that watch the violent cartoons, then the researchers can say that in this experiment, violent cartoons watching cause greater aggressive behavior. Then we make those two groups and we name those two groups as experimental group and control group. The experimental group is a group of subjects who are exposed to all experimental conditions, including the independent variable. Or you can say that subjects in an experiment who are subjected to the independent variable. The name given to the group that gets the independent variable is the experimental group. An experimental group is the group that receives the variable being tested in an experiment. Or in a short, or you can say in a nutshell, it can be said that the experimental group is the group that receives the experimental manipulation. And an experimental group is the group in an experiment that receives the variable being tested. One variable is tested at a time. So the name given to the group that gets the independent variable, for example, the violent cartoons in the example, is the experimental group because it is the group that receives the experimental manipulation. The experimental group is compared to a control group which does not receive the test variables. In this way, the experimental groups are used to find answers in an experiment. Here you can see that, for example, you have made two groups. In experimental group, you have added a biofertilizer or a biofertilizer X. And in the other group, you haven't added the biofertilizer to the plant. Because you want to manipulate that does biofertilizer really work, the X biofertilizer really work or not. So you have made it two groups. In one group, you have given the biofertilizer X to the plant, and in another group you haven't. But you want to check that either it does work or not. So you are manipulating the biofertilizer X group is sprayed and it work or not. So that will be the experimental group because you're manipulating that group. And the control group is not manipulated like the experimental group. So let's start with the control group. The control group is subjects in an experiment who are not subjected to the independent variable and who may receive a placebo treatment. Or you can say the group of subjects who are exposed to all experimental conditions except the independent variable. The other group the one that would get either no treatment or some kind of treatment that should have no effect, like the group that watches the non-violent cartoons in the example, is called the control group because it is used to control for the possibility that other factors might be causing the effect that is being examined. If researchers were to find that both the groups that watched the violent cartoons and the group that watched the non-violent cartoons were equally aggressive, they would have to assume that the violent cartoons did not influence the behavior at all. Now let's start with the random assignment. Random assignment is a process of assigning subjects to the experimental or control group randomly so that each subject has an equal chance of being in either group. Or you can say that assigning the subjects to the experimental condition in such a way that all subjects have an equal chance of being assigned to any of the conditions or group in the study. Random assignment, all the subjects have an equal chance of being assigned to any of the experimental conditions. And random assignment is an important element of a good experimental design. Randomly assigned groups ensure that differences among the subjects are spread out across all the experimental conditions. So because the same criteria are used to assign all the subjects to the experimental conditions, random assignments help ensure that subjects are assigned in an unbiased manner. Random assignment of each participant to one or other condition is also the best way to ensure control over those other interfering or extraneous variable. Extraneous variables are those variables which you intentionally ignore in your study. So sometimes this is simple as picking names out of a hat or a fishbowl. Now let's discuss about the experimental hazards. In experimental hazards, we will be discussing the placebo effect and the experimental effect. So the phenomena in which the expectations of the participant in a study can influence their behavior is called placebo effect. Or you can say that placebo effect is an experimental control group in which the subject are exposed to a fake independent variable is the placebo effect. And the experimenter's effect or expectancy effect. Experimenter's effect is basically the tendency of experimenters' expectations for a study to unintentionally influence the result of the study is known as experimenter's effect. And expectancy effect includes a definition. It's for the subject. The expectancy effect is when subjects have the expectations that certain changes will occur. So the definition of expectancy effect would include changes in a subject's behavior produced by the subject's belief that change should happen. So this is called expectancy effect, whereas experimenter's effect is the effect that is caused by the experimenter. There are a few other, you can say, problems that might arise in any experiment. Even with the use of control groups and random assignments, those problems are especially likely when studying people instead of animals, because people are often influenced by their own thoughts about what's going on in an experiment. For example, say there is a new drug that is supposed to improve memory in people who are in the very early stages of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a form of mental deterioration that occurs in some people as they grow old. So researchers would want to test the drugs to see if it really is effective in helping to improve memory. So they would get a sample of people who are in the early stages of the disease, dividing them into two groups, give one group the drug and then test for improvement. They would probably have to do a test of memory both before and after the administration of the drug, and to be able to measure improvement. The group that gets the drug is experimental group, and the group that doesn't is the control group. Getting or not getting the drug is the independent variable, whereas the measure of the memory improvement is the dependent variable. So I will repeat it, that getting or not getting the drug is the independent variable, whereas the measure of the memory improvement is the dependent variable. But there is still a problem with doing this. What if the researchers do find that drugs group had greater memory improvement than the group that received nothing? Can they really say that the drug itself caused the improvement? Or is it possible that the participants who received the drug knew that they were supposed to improve in memory and therefore made a major effort to do so? So the improvement may have had to do with the participants' belief in the drug than the drug itself, a phenomenon known as placebo effect. The expectations of the participants in a study can influence their behavior. So in medical research, the control group is often given a harmless substitute for the real drug, such as a sugar pill or an injection of salt water, and this substitute, which has no medical effect, is called placebo. If there is a placebo effect, the control group will show changes in dependent variable, even though the participants in the group received only a placebo. And that's where the expectancy effect is applied, because the subjects feel that the changes will occur. So that's why in the control group, the placebo effect is induced, or you can say placebo is provided in the control group. So there's another way that someone's expectations about the outcome of the experiment can influence the results. Even when the participants are animals rather than people, it is called the experimenter's effect. And it has to do with the experimenter's expectations, not the participants. So as we have discussed about naturalistic observations in one of our videos, uh, in which observations sometimes are biased, they see what they expect to see. This can also happen in an experiment. If the researcher is doing the measuring of the dependent variable, so it's possible that he or she could give the participant clues about how they're supposed to respond with body language, or you can say, or tones of voice, tone of voice, or even eye contact. So in this way, the experimental will try to produce or provide clue to the subject. So it wouldn't be deliberate, but it does happen. It could go something like this. In the example, in the example, the Alzheimer's patients are in the experimenter's office to take their second memory test after trying the drug. So the experimenter seems to pay a lot of attention to that person, that Alzheimer's patient, and to every answer that the Alzheimer's patient give in the test, so that patient get the feeling that they are supposed to have improved a lot. So they try harder, and any improvement they do have may be caused only by their own increased effort, not by the drug. So that's the experimenter's effect. The behavior of the experimenter caused the participant to change his or her response. So the solution for the experimenter's effect is double-blind study. In double-blind study, neither the experimenter nor the subject know uh, what is to be manipulated. So that is double-blind study. So that was the end of the video. If you got the point, your concept is clear, you can like the video. And if your concept is not clear, there are still some words which you don't get it, which you don't understand, you can write in the comment, and we will try our level best to provide you the proper definitions and to clear your concepts. If you want to get the notification of the upcoming videos, you can subscribe to our channel. You can also share this video with your friends, because sharing is caring. And you can also request for request-based videos, and we have received lots of requests and we're working on it, and soon, inshallah, in our coming weeks, you will be getting your request-based videos, the videos for which you people have requested. Until then, Allah Hafiz.